Tonight, I'm very excited to have Dr. Mark Epstein here. Mark came up on the train today to be with us. And my background, when I was an undergraduate, I had a double major in Buddhism and in psychology. And those tracks have been central to my life for the last 45 years, and they remain so. And so this is, for me, a great opportunity to sort of bring these two ways of thinking about the world into our conversation here at William James. And I've asked Mark, as we're talking with each other, to think about talking about sort of the interface of Buddhism and psychology, a lot from the idea of what in one of his books he called the synthetic function of the ego, or what Freud called the evenly hovering attention. That question about how do we use that in our clinical experience, and how is it present both in ourselves, in our patients, and perhaps even in the room itself. So we're going to explore things together, and I think Mark and I will sort of have a conversation for about an hour, give or take, and when it feels right, we'll invite all of you to join in the conversation, and let's see what can happen tonight. So I'm excited that everyone's here. So Mark, let me just start by asking you to maybe just talk a little bit about how you understand the synthetic function of the ego, and maybe some about the history, because I know you've written about the history of that, and thinking a little bit about what it looks like for you in terms of your clinical work.
Well, I think maybe the best way to start in talking about that is to talk a little more personally about the development of my own synthetic ego, if we can call it that. You know, sort of like you're about the only other person I've ever met who had those two influences happening from such a young age. I went to college at Harvard, and in my freshman year took an introduction to world religion class, in which the first semester was Eastern religion and the second semester was Western religion. And I sort of stumbled into that class because during orientation I met a girl who I liked, and she said she was taking the class, and it had never occurred to me that, but I went because of that reason. And the Buddhist stuff came early, and the first text that we read was from a collection of verse called the Dhammapada, which is Buddhist verse written for lay people, so not for the monastics, but for householder kind of people. And there was one chapter in there called Mind, and it had a verse in it that was like, "Look to your mind, wise man, look to it well. It is a fickle and treacherous weapon. It's like a fish that flaps on the dry land, trembling all day." And I was like, oh, that's me, you know? So the Buddhist thing spoke to me and sort of put me in this relationship to my own, we might say to my own ego or to my own mind, however we could get into what all those words mean or don't mean from both the Buddhist side and a psychodynamic side, if that's interesting to people. It was interesting to me. So the Buddhist thing came early for me, and I felt lucky for that because I knew hardly anything about anything at that point. But I knew I needed therapy for whatever reason because I was vaguely uncomfortable with myself and kind of anxious. And I went to the health services for therapy shortly thereafter, and there was a very well-dressed practitioner of short-term psychodynamic therapy, which was popular in those days, who I met with 3 times. And he was like, "Oh yeah, you're just suffering from an Oedipus complex. And that should be fine. You should be all right." And I had told him my whole story, you know? And he was like, after 3 times, like, "Okay, that's enough." And I remember like, that experience was like I was just coming into something, and then I bounced off of it, and I had the label, but not the full experience. And then through twists and turns that I could get into if you want to know my whole history, I ended up going out to Colorado, where there was a kind of Buddhist summer camp that was first happening, where a lot of my early Buddhist teachers I met there, Vipassana teachers, Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield and Sharon Salzberg and Ram Dass, and there was the whole New York, Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Bateson, and endless interesting characters. But I tapped into the mindfulness teachers, the Vipassana teachers, early, and they started telling me, like, stop trying to figure out what's wrong with you and just like start to feel, like whatever's going on in your body, in your mind, in this moment. And I always juxtapose that with the Oedipus complex, short-term therapy guide. Because I started to explore the meditation, and the meditation, as I learned it, was really about enhancing some certain ego functions that we've come to call the synthetic ego, or that in the psychodynamic world they call, the therapeutic split in the ego that's established in psychoanalysis, where one part of you is observing another part of you, and it's sort of strange how we're able to do that. It goes back to the Dhammapada thing, like look to your mind, wise man, look to it well, like who's looking at what. So there was a kind of empowering of some capacity that I didn't know I had, which was the ability to experience myself as I was unfolding moment to moment. That has to do with the synthetic ego. And I'll stop talking in a minute. After a few years of mostly devoting myself to the meditation practice, I then still felt the need to go into therapy, and then found a good therapist, a Gestalt therapist, actually around the corner from here. He lived in Newton in those years. And he made me see how what I had learned from meditation could actually start to be employed in an interpersonal way, not just in an intrapersonal way, because the Gestalt therapy that he was a practitioner of was very much about working in the moment with whatever was inhibiting the patient, meaning me, the patient's ego function. That's how they thought about it, like the defenses that one develops in order to cope with being alone in the world when you're growing up start to constrain you in a way, kind of like Wilhelm Reich talked about character armor. It was coming out of that. So his therapy was always about putting me in touch with how I was kind of getting in my own way. And I found that dovetailed very nicely with what I had already started to learn from Buddhism. And those two, I kept going and became a psychiatrist and, et cetera, et cetera. Now I've been a therapist for, 30 years. But I think those were the primary influences. And both of them were supporting what you're calling this strange aspect of the ego, which isn't how we usually think about the ego, because we usually think about it as like, oh yeah, the ego and narcissism and Donald Trump and everything. But this other capacity of the ego is actually encouraged in Buddhism, and I think it's encouraged in most humanistic psychotherapies.
Yeah, so if you think about it in a sort of developmental way.
Yeah.
So thinking about sort of the idea from Piaget, this idea of the synthetic function serving as kind of an integrative capacity for us, is sort of a sign of health.
Yeah.
The capacity to integrate experience. And there's something about developing some kind of awareness that you're talking about, whatever language you want to use, that allows us to remain stable while we come apart at the same time.
Yeah.
Which in therapy, of course, is central to the work we're doing. So I'm interested to know more about, when you're working with patients and you're thinking about this experience of supporting both this capacity to integrate and to maintain some level of equilibrium with attention about the parts of the person that need to come apart or that they need to, I think you would describe as disidentify from or to separate from.
Well, that question leads me in all kinds of directions, even
Great.
just listening to you ask the question, so I don't know if I can answer it in one way. Did you ever know this old friend of mine named Jack Engler?
Yes,
do you know
I
him?
know Jack, yeah.
Is he familiar to any of you? He's around, he's here. And he also was interested in Buddhism, taught religion at UC Santa Cruz, and then went back to Meningers and got a degree as a clinical psychologist. And then I met him when he was interested in Buddhism. And anyway, he did a lot of good work in the 70s and 80s. There was a saying that's attributed to him, you have to be somebody before you can be nobody. That was his way of trying to bring the Buddhist and the psychodynamic worlds together. And he got sort of criticized for that statement, including by me. But I think he was really on to something, which is, if I can explain this right, a lot of people growing up in the West, probably in Buddhist cultures also, suffer from what we would today call developmental traumas, like sort of micro traumas that happen, even pre-verbally. I've been very influenced by Winnicott, who talks about this in another way. Winnicott's whole thing is about a good enough mother or a good enough parent who's able to hold a young child's emotional experiences for them, because an infant even, is full of intense emotion, rage and hunger and love and so on. But doesn't have the cognitive capacity to be able, doesn't have the secondary process to be able to say to himself or herself what's going on. So the mother's job, one of the mother's jobs, or now we wouldn't say the mother anymore, the parent's job is to kind of hold that emotional experience and reinterpret it for the child, like, it's okay, you're just hungry, I know you're angry, but I'm going to give you some food, So to sort of intensify the emotion. So now the language in the field is about attachment, and about the ability to affect tolerance, So a child who's held well enough by the parent develops the ability to not be frightened by their emotions, by the intensity of them. But when there's when there's trouble, either because the parenting isn't good enough or just stuff happens, or then there's like a Ballant called it the basic fault. There's a kind of difficulty that emerges around intense emotional experience, and people have to barricade themselves against it. So that's the idea of developmental trauma. So there's, intense emotion comes, and in an intimate relationship, when someone's older, someone might find themselves acting out in a rageful way, because they can't tolerate the frustration that their boyfriend or girlfriend is making them feel. Or in therapy, the whole transference thing is that patients who are stuck in this kind of way will enact an emotion instead of really feeling it. So the synthetic function of the ego, or the synthetic function of the therapist, or what we learn to do in meditation, is to create either an intrapsychic environment or an interpersonal environment in which the person can begin to hold or feel or see those kinds of emotions that before then they were blind to, that were just making them act in ways that they really had no control over. Addictive kinds of behaviors, or you see it a lot in anorexia, I mean, you see it in alcoholism, you see it everywhere. So I think all of the, like, meditation from the one side, Buddhism from that side, psychodynamic therapy from the other side, are basically encouraging this kind of ability. Even dialectical behavioral therapy, which was begun by Marsha Linehan, who was herself suffering from these, kind of borderline pathology, and also had studied Buddhism, and took her experience with Buddhism and brought it, combined it with her background as a behaviorist, and had the great insight that suicidal borderline patients who the therapists were all seeing as like hyper emotional and out of control actually were phobic towards their own emotions. So she developed a kind of systematic desensitization for people to help them feel what they were feeling. So that's all the same rubric as far as I'm concerned.
So let's imagine for a second that you don't prescribe to your patients to meditate or to, but
I've been very cautious about that.
Yes,
yeah.
I know that. So I'm thinking about the development of this synthetic awareness in the process of therapy.
Yeah.
Like, does it happen through the patient sort of experiencing you and the way that you are holding them and encountering them and sort of thinking about it as...
If we don't use that language.
Yes, of course.
I'm not holding them.
Yeah, not literal. We're not talking literal. But I'm thinking along the lines of that you're trying to create some kind of space, in not just literal space, but a sort of psychological space that is being communicated to the patient in a way that invites them to start looking at themselves. And let's imagine that there's something to that. How do you do it? Like, how do you get us closer to it?
The thing about that, like when we use that language, which I use also, the holding and creating the space and the interpersonal field and all of that, it's so abstract. Freud's language was, the unobjectionable positive transference. Unobjectionable positive transference. He couldn't just say love, because that was like, he left that to Jung, who got into trouble. But I think it's basically friendship. I think therapy, it's like, I'm not sitting there meditating, and I'm not pulled back in some kind of abstract, withdrawn state. Yeah. I mean, I will wait, like I've learned to wait, so I'm not leading the conversation unless someone is like really anxious and needs me to. But I think therapy's totally, it only works when there's a friendship, when the person likes you and when I am fond of them, And usually, if that isn't there, the person doesn't come back. It's pretty rare that there'll be like that kind of tension where I don't really like this person and they don't really like me, and it keeps going. Sometimes, I mean, there's a lot of, in the psychodynamic world, everybody's into hate and anger, I think a kind of misreading of Winnicott and so on. And so I hear some of my patients who are in training and these kinds of places, their supervisors are just all about, you're hating your patient, and really they're hating you, and you're not bringing out the hate enough, and stop with this, being so nice. But I think it's really all based in, like, this person, for some reason, they're comfortable with me, they like me, they're sort of a little bit challenged by me, or surprised, I think, is the...
So surprised I'm thinking this sort of...
But there's trust.
Yeah.
I mean, it's basic. It's like Eric Erikson, or Maslow or something. It's like the trust has to be there.
It's experiential.
It's experiential.
There's something about the experiential feeling connection between you and the patient.
And but it's not. It builds. I think that's the thing about, if I'm creating any kind of space, I'm creating a space for that trust to build because I believe that it can. And I think maybe I got something from the Buddhist side where I believe in people, like maybe too much sometimes. Like I could be too supportive and miss how maybe they're more destructive than I'm giving them credit for. But I have a basic belief in the potential of the person that I'm with, and and I can feel it there, and so I'm kind of waiting and waiting and waiting, and developing some kind of rapport. People tend to stay for a fairly long time in my therapy work with them, and it always surprises me years and years into treatment. Oh, then they finally start to talk about why they're there, or the thing that they didn't tell me about that they've been worrying about since it happened, or anyway. So
yeah.
So that's one element of surprise.
And sort of, let me extend that a tiny bit. So I'm imagining myself for a second into what you're talking about and thinking, is there a way in which you are in each moment sort of surrendering your knowing about what you think should be happening, surrendering a sort of a goal for the person, surrendering your own, even think about it as your kind of rational understanding, your logical mind in some way, and yet you're trying to communicate and connect. I'm thinking about this idea, you're talking about the synthetic function as the ego as a matrix now, not a single entity. And is there some way where we enter into, let's think of it as the matrix, through our surrendering of our kind of our logical knowledge? It's not that it's not there, but it's in the background, and that we are communicating and connecting more through this other matrix, which we are joined in with that.
Well, in the psychoanalytic world, when a lot of my supervisors when I was doing my training were classically trained psychoanalysts. They're not so prominent anymore, probably, but that was sort of like, they were the smart people when I was doing my training. And the emphasis there was always on formulating a perfect, quote unquote, interpretation, where with that part of your mind that you're suggesting maybe I'm surrendering, you're putting together what's happening in the moment, in the transference, in the relationship, with what happened to them when they were younger, when the defense or whatever was established, with what's happening inside of them emotionally. And the formulation and the interpretation was meant to be the thing that broke open, and I was always really bad at that. So I was good at, when you come to this field, becoming a therapist through medical school, which for some reason I did, they don't give you any training in how to be a therapist. It's like the medical model, which is see one, do one, or whatever it is, like in surgery. So my first rotation in psychiatry was at McLean's, and as a medical student, and I went in, and the second day they gave me a patient. Like, okay, this is your patient, and I was like, nervous. And I had no idea, and they hadn't told me what to do. So all I had to draw on was what I had already learned from meditation. I sort of knew how to be with my own mind in that way that you're talking about. Like, you have to surrender something in meditation, or else it drives you crazy, because you're trying to get relaxed or trying to have no stress, and that doesn't work. So you have to lay back a little bit. So I kind of knew how to do that, and I did that with my patient, and she liked me because I wasn't like laying any trip on her, so to speak. And then she started to talk to me, and then once in a while I would have an idea of something that I might say that might be helpful, And I think that from then on, that's what therapy has been for me. I had good supervisors and so on, but mostly I was not telling them the details of whatever was going on in the room, with one or two exceptions. So I was really feeling it out from that place.
Yeah.
And I think I understood something from my experience with my own mind about how to sneak past the superficial defenses in order to be surprised by what might emerge that I couldn't have anticipated. So I do think I start every session, even with people who I know very well, from that place of, like, okay, what's my second therapist used to start every session with, I would come in and he would go, "What's with you, Mark?" And I quizzed him about that at one point, and he said he started every session like that. He didn't like how are you feeling, but he was very acerbic, more than I'm a little gentler in my approach. But I rarely start the session, and I wait to see what will come. And people often, I was like this in therapy, like I would always hope for a dream, because then I would have something I could talk about. So people often have a prepared thing that they come in with, and you can sort of tell the difference. You can tell when the prepared thing is done, and then that space of a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of awkwardness, that's good in therapy. Like you want not too much, but you want enough of that so that someone, people don't have to know why they've come, because I trust that the material that needs to be worked through, to use that language, will come up on their own if I'm not getting in the way of it.
Yeah.
So
you're encouraging them and sort of modeling them how to let go of the control to manage their anxiety, so
in some way
they can begin to encounter their own experience.
Yeah, and in some way I'm offering myself as a way of helping to manage their anxiety also. Like it's okay to be anxious,
Yeah.
like that, like we all are.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it helps to try to put words on it. That's a special thing that we do in therapy, is put words on stuff.
Well, what comes to my mind when you're talking about that is that if you think about sort of the interface of Buddhism and psychology, it's so much about, I think you even wrote about this once, about how the goal is to allow the agency to emerge from, I think what Suzuki would call the unborn matrix, from this larger systemic mind. Mm-hmm. And that the goal is to let go of individual agency. I don't know if let go is the right word, but to sort of allow to be informed by a different experience. And it brings to mind one of my mentors and people I really admire is a man from Japan named Toshio Kawai, who's a Japanese Buddhist, Jungian actually. And he would talk about, when he was doing therapy, that he would try to situate himself between the personal and the impersonal. And that his goal was to somehow to try to locate himself at the center of the person's suffering and their sorrow. And he tried to work from that place.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very Japanese
formulation. Yeah. But I was just thinking about that. I mean, this idea of, if we're surrendering our knowing, we're sort of engaging, inviting this other part of not only the patient's experience, but our own experience into the room. And what is that, how does that work in terms of the therapy, or, if you think about Kuwai's idea?
Yeah, that's interesting, between the personal and the impersonal. Because, there's that famous thing by Anna Freud where she said she would try to position herself in a triangle, in the equidistant from id, ego, and superego.
Yeah.
Like that's the position of the therapist. I think about that a lot.
Yeah.
Because there's so much self-judgment in a lot of people, or even self-loathing, and weird relationships that people have to their own desire, or to their own anger, or there's this famous paper by Winnicott, called "Hate and the Countertransference," which is where that whole reliance on anger and so on is rooted in that. But he talks a lot about how a therapist to be any use has to be comfortable with the intensity of their own anger, even anger or at the patients, in order to be loving. That sentimentality is of no use in parenting or in therapy. So you can't be like kind of fake, like being real. See, I think one of the lessons that I've really tried to embody is being real as myself with my patients. So, and that, in a way, I think that might go a little bit against. It depends how you understand what he's saying. That placing yourself, in the heart of the patient's suffering. Like, I know I, as a patient, was always looking for a therapist who could be real with me. And even with my Buddhist teachers, I felt very lucky that I met them when I was young and they were young, and I got to know them as friends, not just as gurus, so that I could see all their foibles and their personalities and what they were struggling with. And that gave me so much agency for myself. Like, I didn't have to pretend to be other than who I was.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was such a relief. Yeah. For me, anyway. And I think that has really influenced me as a therapist, which goes against the psychoanalytic mode of the people that were training me, of the blank screen. That was sort of going out of fashion anyway. But the relational movement in psychoanalysis, which was much more about, the therapist is a real person and can be a real person, and but people want that and respond to that, and then that becomes very interesting. Like, how can you be yourself and a real person but not intrude, not impinge, not get in the way of somebody's process? When is it good to reveal? I see my patients. My office is in the basement of a building in Lower Manhattan that my family, that we live in. So, and my wife, who's a sculptor, her studio is right next to my office in this basement. So my patients are coming in and run into my wife. They're seeing the building that I live in. When my kids were little, they'd be, in the hallway. And I was like, I would run into, I saw a lot of artists because my wife was an artist, and my office was in Lower Manhattan, and we would run into each other at openings. And, I was very free with, this is who I am, and you have to deal with it. But how to do that and still be sensitive to when it wasn't right. That's been very interesting for me.
The whole nature of self-disclosure.
Yeah, that whole issue, which people are starting to write about now
to be more real
in the field. Yeah, where do you draw the line? And I think it's different with every patient.
Mm-hmm.
But,
yeah, that makes sense to me. I think it is as well.
Somehow the Buddhist thing of no self, my understanding of it made me much more comfortable being myself. And I've always enjoyed that paradox about it. I think it helps for psychotherapy.
Say more about that.
Well, it gets into the whole, most people even pretty sophisticated people in Buddhism, I think, don't quite get the whole notion of selflessness or emptiness or egolessness. There can be a kind of wish to jettison one's agency altogether and just float in a kind of selfless, supposedly selfless place that reads as kind of fake. And my friend Robert Thurman tells a good story about his first teacher, who was a Mongolian Lama in exile in New Jersey. And he used to say to Thurman, it's not that you're not real. Like, of course you're real. You have a self like everybody else. Your problem is you think you're really real. And so it's that element of really real that the Buddhist selflessness is trying to unhinge. We take ourselves more seriously than we need to. We construct stories about who we are that then we get attached to and we repeat to ourselves, and our patients do that too. So the experience of a no self is like no fixed notion. Like, stay on the side of mystery about yourself. Like, don't be so sure that you know everything about yourself. One of my early teachers was Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, who used to be here too. And his main line was, "You're not who you think you are," which was that was very good for me to hear when I was young.
And so in therapy, then part of your work is to help people identify these stories that they're
try to find that. Yeah, they come out. Like, if I, as the therapist, lay back and wait, you don't have to wait too long before those stories. We talk about them as narratives now. But they're etched in deeply. The deep ones, that are attached to unworthiness and self-loathing and shame and early experiences that foster a kind of insecurity that people then take to be the definition of what's wrong with them. I'm all about, like, oh yeah, tell me that one, and then try to poke a hole in it. And people they can get it in the moment. Like a little glimmer of, oh, really? And how do I do that for myself?
Yeah. I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking about what you were writing about with Lowell, talking about this idea of the even hovering attention, that one of the intentions of working from this place is to invite people to fall into parts of themselves that are unknown.
Yeah.
And kind of the tension of that, of poking a hole, at the same time sort of trying to create some kind of space for this unknown to emerge.
Yeah.
The mystery part.
Well, the thing I loved about Lowell, Hans Lowell, brilliant psychoanalyst, what I remember about him, which I think you're referring to, he had this great phrase of turning ghosts into ancestors. So that gets back to that idea of developmental trauma, and where people get stuck in either what was done to them, or what wasn't done for them, or what was wrong with them. Those are the ghosts. But so not to pretend that you can eliminate your history, or even eliminate the stories that you've told yourself for years about your history, but to instead of being haunted by them, to sort of put them on the way the Chinese have the ancestors above the doorway. Like, you can sort of have it there, but no, it's just a statue,
Mm-hmm.
And respect it, honor it, but not be defined by it. It's the not being defined so much that leaves you open to discovery. which is a different kind of agency.
You're working in this place of identification where people are, maybe you could think of as over-identified or identified with these stories in some way.
Yeah.
And you're trying to create some kind of space so then they can let go or allow something else to start to emerge.
So the question is, how do you create the space?
Yeah.
The work of Fonagy and mentalization and so on. So he's sort of coming out of Winnicott, and he also is talking about what the parents do for children in the intensity of their emotional reactions to things, and he has this thing about how the parent relates to the child with a sense of irony, like taking their experience seriously, but not that seriously, like making fun of it a little bit.
Like a little separation from it.
Yeah, and I think that therapists can do that when they're connected to the patient. I think that it's like a parental, like parents do it spontaneously, naturally, and I think we do it for each other also, and I think therapists can do that, and I think it works in a kind of similar way. It creates just a little bit of distance, and I think meditation is doing that. In that thing I was talking about before about you think you're really real, so. The Lama is saying that to Thurman, and it makes Thurman, he feels how he sees himself as really real, and then, like however that is, and then can let go of that extra bit for a moment. And I think that's often all the good Buddhist stories are always about that.
Yeah. I'm interested, one thing I was thinking about as I read your books is it strikes me that you've shifted a little bit of your understanding or the way that you think about working with emotion. I was thinking in your earlier books you talked a lot about, I think really from a kind of more traditional Buddhist perspective of the need to we think of ourselves through our emotions and we need to create some kind of space from that. Whereas in your later books, my sense is that you're talking about this idea of that there's been a sort of a debasement of emotion, and maybe we could think about that in terms of some of the even modalities of therapy where the focus is, which is not on emotion necessarily. But I'm thinking about this idea that you talk about, instead of thinking of emotions as alien or the enemy, to think of it about as a long lost cousin and as a pathway into spontaneity. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your journey on that.
Well, I think you're really right about that in terms of the evolution in my thinking. There's a tendency from the Buddhist side to approach emotion with a kind of duality. Like there are wholesome feelings and there are unwholesome feelings, and there are destructive emotions. There are a lot of Buddhist books with that title, afflictive emotion, destructive emotion, toxic emotion, greed, hatred, and delusion as poisons, and there's a place in meditation where that way of looking at things can be helpful to people because they're so identified with and mired in their own difficult emotions that they're taken over by them, and the meditation is meant to create some distance so that when the emotion comes up, you can note it and label it and then move yourself away. So that was definitely a big influence on my thinking at the beginning, and you can kind of see that, I think, in cognitive therapy now. There's a real tendency towards that. I think that's one of the ways that mindfulness and cognitive therapy have merged together and kind of support each other. And even there's this book on the bestseller list now called Why Buddhism is True, And a couple of weeks ago in the New Yorker, Adam Gopnik wrote a big review of that, and talked about how, even he, Adam Gopnik, writer for the New Yorker, is meditating a little bit. And he's kind of taking that position also. And that's one of the ways meditation has taken hold. The primitive part of the brain, the amygdala, is ruling us, and the fight or flight response, and we're all wired like a primitive person, but that part of the brain is going off in traffic jams and in the supermarket, and we need to kind of regulate it with our higher cortical functioning. So that is true sometimes, but it's pejorative towards our emotional life. So I think the pivot for me came, I wrote this book called Open to Desire, where I was trying to rescue desire from the Buddhists who were stamping on it, and a lot of the people coming to see me in New York who were more creative types and wanted relationships and weren't afraid of sex too much, were kind of put off by that anti-emotional stance of Buddhism, and as was I. There is the more hidden tantric schools that grew up in Buddhism that stopped taking that dualistic view and instead saw that even in intense emotions there was the seed of something good. And so I tried to write about desire from that place of, it's not that desire is bad, it's that your desires are too small. And even the desire for enlightenment is a desire. And
Or say more, desire is too small.
We're wanting another drink, or wanting ice cream, or hoping that a relationship will do everything for us. But what we're really looking for is something greater than that,
yes.
or something more meaningful than that.
Got it.
Is that allowed? That is like bringing the spiritual into psychotherapy. Is the desire for what we imagine as God, or what we think of as enlightenment, is that kosher? Are you allowed? Is that reasonable even? And in the Buddhist world, in those sort of hidden, more secret dimensions of Buddhism, they compare the experience of liberation, of enlightenment, actually to a healthy sexual relationship, because in a regular life, the closest that one can come to what the Buddha promised was reality is the experience of orgasm. So they talk about the 4 levels of realization as looking, smiling, embracing, and orgasm. Because that's the closest that we come to letting go of that defensive aspect of the self that actually keeps us away from our true potential. So I think emotional experience, like we understand in therapy, where we're trained to follow the affect. We're not afraid of affect. Like Winnicott wasn't afraid of anger. We want to look at that and experience that and use that to open ourselves. So that's where my thinking has gone. So,
how do you use emotion in your therapy work? Do you use your own affective experience in the room? How do you work in that realm?
I think I'm very attuned. I wouldn't say I'm using it like Fritz Perls, getting angry at my patients or making fun of them or anything. But I think I'm very sensitive to my own, to what's being churned up in me when someone is being real. I think there are micro communications that happen that are about the rapport. So if someone is telling me something moving, I'm sure I'm revealing being moved. I think that's probably really mostly how, rather than that I'm monitoring my, what comes up in me to use my association to help deepen my patient's experience. I would say I probably am not doing that. That's not so active most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, in the Jungian world, they talk sometimes about this idea of a syntonic countertransference, which is, like a radio antenna.
Yeah.
That where some emotion or some part of somebody's experience is coming into the field.
Yeah.
And somehow the therapist's antennas pick it up.
Yeah.
And it can be an affective experience, it could be a memory, it could be lots of different parts.
Yeah.
And the question is to use one's experience in that way.
Well, Freud was into that.
Yeah.
And Melanie Klein, developed this idea of projective identification.
Yeah.
Which is when a patient is so uncomfortable in that way I was talking about before, so defended against or so dissociated from some core emotional experience that they actually can't experience it, and somehow through some magical way of transmission that you're referring to, the therapist experiences the intensity of the emotion, and that definitely goes on. The object relations people are very into that. For a year in my training, I had Otto Kernberg as a one-on-one supervisor, and he was like the expert in the psychodynamic treatment of borderline personality, and he was an object relations person, and he was a very rational in a certain way. Very good, right? Worth reading. Really one of the best supervisors I ever had. But he was all over that experience, like that. He helped me the most with, how to help my intensely disturbed, dissociated, angry patients who were enacting their anger through me. Gave me language to use and so on. So that definitely goes on.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think with all kinds of people, but with people who are struggling more with difficult emotions, what we're talking about.
But I'm interested in, I think about this in my own work too, this idea of using or working from, go back to the idea of a matrix. Working from the matrix itself, this other type of awareness, what William James himself obviously called the noetic intelligence, or the mother sea of consciousness, is what his exact phrase was. So to be able to work from that place in the therapy.
Well, the thing about work, I believe in all that, but the thing about working from that place, I have found, is that you only get there by being real with yourself. So I think it's easy to imagine when we have this kind of discussion that really, as a therapist, you're putting yourself into some other consciousness and then you're working from that place. And I don't think that's right. I think that other consciousness is actually it's in us already. It's right there.
Stored consciousness.
It's just right there. Like you don't have to do anything to be working from that place. You just have to get out of your own way enough for it to shine through. And I think that's the thing in meditation. A lot of people get into meditation and they're trying to get to some other place. And it doesn't work like that. Like, you just really have to be there with yourself as you are. And then you start to see, oh yeah, I can be here with myself as I am. And I'm operating from a slightly different place than I normally do. And that's a tiny little shift. But I think if you haven't experienced it, you don't know. And it really, I think a lot of therapists work from that place, without having to meditate.
Yeah.
They sit down in their chair and they go there. I think a lot of like basketball players or musicians or actors go to that place too. But I do think it can be practiced, and meditation's good for that.
Yeah. I have just two more questions or thoughts, and then I want to invite everyone else to come into the conversation. But just along those lines, you made me think about when I was reading, I think it was Psychotherapy Without a Self, you talked about Bion's work in there, and you were talking about something that I as he's talking about using this kind of attention that we're talking about, that he talked about the need, these exercises that he developed, and the need to, I can't remember the language, but around a memory. About
to be free from memory.
To be free from memory. And that confused me because when I'm working, memory is often comes in, and it's not that I'm completely taken over by the memory, but I'm remembering a moment, I'm linking something together. Think about Bion, I'm linking some piece of the work. But what do you think he was talking about there?
Oh, I think he said a therapist, to be useful, has to be able to be free from memory and desire. That was his classic thing. And he said he said if he goes on in one, he talks about it a lot, but one that I really remember, he says even being conscious of the time is an obstruction, an impingement. Like the therapist, like don't be looking at the clock, because the patient experiences, even unconsciously, in that telepathic way you were alluding to before, the patient experiences your preoccupation with the time or with your own hope for the patient's cure. That's what he means by desire, that you're wanting them to be better. Which is sort of like when you're meditating, like you're wanting not to think. So he says the patient, and Winnicott says the same thing. That Winnicott's language is even more intense. He says the patient experiences that as like a rape. But he's definitely talking about that micro communication. So Bion approached it like, the therapist has to do a lot of exercises to tidy up their mind and so on. I quarrel with that a little bit because I always find that when it's going well in a therapy, like that I'm automatically freed from memory and desire. That I'm just, like when you're there with someone, maybe sometimes, like you're saying, you'll think about this or that if it's relevant, like the thought will just come. But you're not, I think what he's saying is you're not looking to memory. He's talking about trying to remember from the last session, right. Like what happened in the last session. And that I find, I never try to remember.
Yeah, right.
I don't think about my patients unless someone's like suicidal or something. I don't think about them in between sessions. And now that I'm like 64 years old, I'm like forgetting people's names, in my regular life. But when someone comes in and sits down, like what I need to remember, it comes right back. It still surprises me. And what I don't remember, usually it's meaningful, but then they have to tell me again. Like, oh, it comes up again, I totally forgot that. But I even trust that, my own forgetting.
So he's talking about like memory as a form of control, or as a defense almost.
Trying to help. Yeah. He's talking about like don't be trying to be smart. That the therapist's erudition is experienced the way I experienced that practitioner of short-term psychoanalytic. Like he was so polished, and he had the right words, but it was alienating. So so you have to watch out for your erudition. You have to watch out for wanting to seem smart. Even the desire to help, as much as we all do this because we want to help. We do help and we can help, but you have to be careful with the desire about it. I think it's very extreme. It was radical when he said it, and then like all radical, helpful things, it becomes people turn it into like, oh, I don't have any, I don't remember anything, or I'm trying to be without, So then you have to change the language to keep it fresh. But
yeah, okay. Just one last question. This is something I've been thinking a lot about, and I was thinking about this in your writing, and I think about this in terms of my reflection over the years about Buddhism. It's the idea of the sort of the nature of image.
Of image?
Of image, yeah. That, sometimes, maybe this goes back to some of the way we're talking about emotion, that sometimes image is thought of as, it's a representation of yourself. It's not the reality. It's not think of it as primordial reality. And then, whereas, say Jung, for example, would think about image as actually the face, I think we might think of it, of primordial reality, of the psyche itself. Image is the way that we know psyche. So I'm just curious about your sense of how you think about image, and how you work with image, if you do, and sort of in that kind of dialectic that I'm talking about.
Well, I think about it more in terms of the unconscious.
And what kind of unconscious, I guess, is what we're talking about.
Yeah, what kind? Well, so I'm much more schooled in the Freudian, neo-Freudian, like those are, even though I'm not an analyst, but that what I read and who I was taught by and so on. So the classic thing of the unconscious is that it's like the roiling instincts and the darkness and the dream, where dreams come from, and the primordial sea, more like that, but the Buddhist unconscious comes more into the Jungian mode, where all the darkness is that, like all that energy, the sexual energy, the violent energy, the aggressive energy, even the life instinct, the death instinct, all of that energy in Buddhism is being tapped by one's own synthetic ego, or one's own consciousness, or one's own courage, or one's own willingness to open oneself, uncritically but skillfully with ethics. That energy is being tapped to be put to use for the welfare of others. Yeah. That's the once you get yourself out of the way. Like you can't just disappear. You're still here, but you're not taking yourself so seriously anymore. So what's all that primordial juice for? It's to be of service. So somehow combining those two visions of image or of the unconscious, I think, is motivating me in the background with my patients to try to give them some hope, some faith, some kind of different kind of faith than we usually think about faith. That one can. There's a psychoanalyst named Michael Eigen, who I don't know if he wrote a great book called The Psychoanalytic Mystic. He's written about 15 books, but that's the best one. But he talks about becoming partners with the capacities that constitute us. And I really like that phrase. Yeah. It has the synthetic thing of being partners with, and then the capacities that constitute us, like the whole range, right. Like that we can hold them, embody them, and put them to use. So.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think a lot, early on, I was really influenced by Merleau-Ponty and the primacy of perception.
Yeah, that was like too much for me.
But I mean, just this idea of how do we access this other realm that we're thinking about in Buddhism, and that our patients are trying to access. And
Well, the Gestalt people that's my two good therapists were Gestalt people. They had it down. They had a very simple construct, which was that it was relational as its primary central way of thinking, that in healthy contact, there's a dissolution of self. So if you think about sex as, healthy contact, but even in rapport or in conversation, that there's a kind of rhythm to that we're both separate individuals, but also capable of connection, capable of union, in which that sense of separateness dissolves. But there's a rhythm to that. We're not only in the primary ooze, and we're not only totally separate, and that the dysfunctions in ego, the inhibitions of ego function, keep us from that, what they call healthy confluence, which is the contact where there's dissolution. So that the more we can see how we're getting in our own way, then the more healthy kind of dissolution, and that sense of going to pieces without falling apart. That there's that. So I like that formulation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of
I like it for therapy too.
Yeah. So we still have a good 35, 40 minutes here if people are interested in asking questions. The one thing I would ask is that if you mind standing up and speaking slowly when you ask, just so we can really hear you and everybody in the room can hear you. Unfortunately, there aren't any mics to hand around, but if you stand up and speak slowly and loudly, we'll get what you're asking. So feel free. Thank you. I'm sorry.
If you don't mind.
I'm wondering about practices of gratitude and how that can help to allow some of the more difficult, painful emotions where it all belongs, but how do you see that? And I'm also wondering about humor and laughter.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that when something is very true, there's a release of energy.
Yeah.
It's like, ha!
Mm-hmm.
And I notice it's not spoken about, both by the Buddhist teachers nor by the psychotherapy teachers.
Yeah.
Generally don't talk about laughter a whole lot.
Yeah.
But they're very funny people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's some good papers to be written about humor. I think that's a good, interesting thing. Freud was into jokes and everything. In terms of the gratitude, do you have thoughts about that?
Please.
Okay. There are practices in Buddhism. I assume that's what you're talking about, like loving kindness practices and so on. Compassion, where you deliberately cultivate a compassionate attitude towards people you're close to, people you feel neutral about, and people you can't stand. And for a long time, I was kind of suspicious of those meditations because they felt fake to me, and I thought, the real meditation is when you're practicing mindfulness or when you're looking for insight into your own insubstantiality. But I've come around to seeing the value of those kinds of practices. I think the danger in them is that it becomes another sort of superego injunction, like, I have to feel loving towards my mother, but I really don't, and then you're in a kind of. But I think when those practices are encouraged by people who have really done them themselves, they can get in underneath all of that stuff, and then it's pretty interesting. People, I think, report the most sort of transformative experiences when they're practicing on the neutral people. It's usually like the guy at the corner who sells you your newspaper, or the person in the supermarket who checks you out, or who really you have very little relationship with, but when you start to send them loving energy, then when they say the newspaper, you actually look at them, you look at in their eyes, or you say something you wouldn't have said otherwise, or you hear them in a different. Anyway, people really open up around that practice. The gratitude thing is a little different. The Tibetans have this practice of seeing all beings as your mother, and realizing that if reincarnation is real and samsara is endless, cyclic existence is endless, then really all beings have been your mother at some point, and you've been their mother at some point. So then you imagine yourself both as mother and as child, I'm imagining holding you as my baby, you're imagining holding me as your baby, and that plugs into Melanie Klein and envy and gratitude and so on. And that becomes pretty interesting when you take it seriously. I always had trouble with that. In one of my books, I talk about a visiting Tibetan Lama who's like, oh, Westerners can't do that practice. They have too much stuff with their mothers. So I always tell them, imagine that everyone was your grandmother, because they have an easier time with that. But
I think it was Otto Kronberg mentioned you had been supervised by.
Yeah.
You had said that you learned sort of the language in helping people who may be struggling with severe anger or dissociative states or that kind of thing. And you may have, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that language.
yeah, sure.
And what it looks like.
Yeah. The question, just in case you had trouble hearing, is about when I said I had Otto Kernberg as a supervisor and how much he had helped me with patients who were struggling with intense anger and so on, that they were estranged from, in essence. He basically said, you have to tell them that you sense how uncomfortable they are with how angry they must be feeling towards you. That instead of saying, "Look how angry you are," to lead with the defense, basically, like you must not realize, or you must be. Do you realize how uncomfortable you are with I don't know if I'm getting it quite right, but how uncomfortable you are with how angry you're feeling about this or towards me, and how much in danger you are of destroying the thing you need the most, whether it be the relationship with the therapist or the parent or the spouse or whatever. That tension between how important the relationship is and how angry it's making them, and therefore how responsible they have to be, even in the midst of acknowledging what it's making them feel. That let me talk about it in a different kind of way. And it worked.
Kind of like separating them a little bit from the feeling.
Yeah, I think they're not connected to the feeling. So I'm not sure it's separate. I think the effort is in that synthetic way again. It's trying to let them be connected to it in a way where it's not going to be unbearable, or it's not going to destroy them. The idea with trauma is that the ego is always trying to protect itself from falling apart, because it's fragile and vulnerable. So an unbearable affect of whatever kind, in anger being one of the most unbearable things we can experience, unbearable affect is like dissociated. It's shunted away because the ego has to preserve itself. So I think that comment, if I'm remembering it properly, is to help someone see how dangerous the feeling actually is for their ego, and thereby, in acknowledging it, it lets it sneak back in a little bit. And because the person is a grown-up now, like when they got dissociated from it, they were 5 years old, and so it seemed much bigger. Now it's like, oh yeah, of course you're going to be angry at me. I'm your therapist, and after an hour or 50 minutes or 45 minutes, whatever it is, like the time is up, and no, I'm not going to take your phone call, but I'm going to be here for you the next time you come, and that's a frustrating kind of relationship to have, but really I'm here for you, and I will be here for you next week, even if you want to kill me, and I won't let you kill me, hopefully. Doesn't happen that often.
You had said that you're very cautious of being prescriptive.
Yeah.
Could you say more about that?
Yeah. I just wrote a new book, actually, that's about that sort of. It's called Advice Not Given. And then the subtitle is A Guide to Getting Over Yourself. But I got the title first. I was actually on a meditation retreat, and the phrase came to me because I think I was thinking in the back of my mind about how I've been very cautious about offering the Buddhist thing as any kind of therapeutic regimen, for anybody, because I didn't want to be laying it on like I was some kind of evangelist or whatever, or hoping that it would cure somebody. But this phrase, advice not given, it came, and I realized, like maybe I've been being too cautious about it and hold this thing that has actually been so useful to me, so important to me, even though I've written all these books and whatnot, that I don't actually lead with it or even suggest it very often. I wait for people to ask about it. I don't hide that I'm interested in it, obviously, and I will talk about it if people ask me to, but I don't often offer it prescriptively. And then I started to question myself, like maybe I could be a little freer now that, I'm this age and known for it, and so I started, and then I came right out of the retreat and started to think about, I could, maybe I should write about this a little bit. And then right away, 3 of my patients, almost like in the same week, asked me if I would teach them to meditate, like in the session. And I was like, there are cheaper ways to learn to meditate than paying my hourly fee. But if you want to, we could. And that was interesting, because I did, and each one of them was like, had a different reaction to it, but they were all worried that they weren't doing it right. They all had a kind of common beginning reaction to meditation, and it was, and I could see how therapeutic it was. One person wanted to know, everyone wants to know, like, if I do it for 30 minutes, like once a day, is that, or should I do it 20 minutes twice a day? And I was like, the time, like, that's all coming out of transcendental meditation, where it got sold as 20 minutes twice a day, and the relaxation response, and in Vipassana, you sit for an hour, and it's like really the time is going to cure you? So, it doesn't, I meditate without the clock, like I sit, and then when I'm done, I stop. So I try to encourage that sort of way of relating to it, like 5 minutes, like who cares, And one person got into a nice space very easily, but then couldn't do it again, and it's like, and that's another classic, like you could spend years chasing the first good experience that you had in meditation, thinking that was the point. But and the point is sort of to see how you chase the the good thing, and can't let go of it. That's actually the point, because that's where the clinging is. So it let me use what I understand about Buddhist language, which I love, which has helped me so much. Let me sort of incorporate that way of speaking, which I might be freer in this kind of setting to speak that way, like the Four Noble Truths and the first noble truth of the Buddha, that life is suffering. The word he used was dukkha. It doesn't really mean, like, it's classically interpreted as suffering, but it has more of a sense of unsatisfactoriness. The actual word, if you take it apart, it just means hard to face. Like, there's a word sukha, which is sweetness, which is like easy to face, and dukkha means difficult to face. Ka is face, and dukkha is like, bad, hard, bad. So that the sense of that we're all estranged from some aspects of ourselves or of life that's hard to face, but in meditation we're going to try to open ourselves to look at everything with the same sort of equilibrium or equanimity, ultimately, so that the easy to face, the hard to face, we're like willing to face, and that the second noble truth, the cause of suffering, is clinging. Like, what do we mean by clinging? Who's clinging to what? So it let me, sort of begin to talk about all of that in the context of teaching my patients. So that was liberating, and maybe helpful. And then we settled back in. Really, people come to therapy because there's stuff they need to talk about, but they could, then experiment with the meditation themselves, and then come and talk to me about it if they need to. So I've loosened up around that. I'm not so worried about it, that people will take it the wrong way.
So earlier during your comments on the intersectionality of psychology and Buddhism, you borrowed this quote, I think, turning ghosts into ancestors.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could expand a little more on that in terms of symbolism and meaning making for clients or even maybe therapists.
Say the last part again, symbolic.
If you could expand a little
Yeah.
more on that in terms of symbolism and meaning making.
Oh, symbolism and meaning making. Sure. Yeah, I'll repeat it. The question's about the phrase I used before about turning ghosts into ancestors. And if I could expand on that a little bit, especially in relationship to symbolism and meaning making in therapy. Well, what I'm particularly attuned to when I'm thinking that way is what I was referring to before about the early developmental little t traumas that some people, many people who come to therapy are carrying. And how that usually manifests is some kind of self-hatred or shame or chronic kind of self-criticism or vague sense, kind of insecurity, vague sense there's something the matter with me that that people are keeping private because they're ashamed of, and so on. So those are the ghosts. They can be it can be very specific. Like some people who were sexually abused, by their camp counselors or uncles, or were physically abused by their alcoholic parents, or just had some kind of vaguer sense of, Winnicott used to say, like, nothing happening when something might profitably have happened. So then more the sense of neglect, where the child is self-referential almost always. So the child takes whatever has gone wrong and tries to explain it in a kind of primitive way by blaming it on themselves. It must be something wrong with me. Usually it wasn't something wrong with them, but the the myth that becomes static, or that is integrated into the psyche is about where the fault is. So once that gets exposed in therapy, which can take a long time, for it really to come out, for someone to actually start to talk about it freely, because it's not easily talked about. But once it does get talked about and sort of batted back and forth, and oh yeah, we know this, and so on, then there's the opportunity to reformulate. So I don't think it's so much about creating another image, but it's about being realistic, about what actually happened, or might have happened. We don't really know. I can't remember anything before I was 4 or 5, and I think that's common for most people. But I feel like a lot of what I had to work through intimately and emotionally in my life came from before I was 4 or 5. But I'm mostly making that up because I don't really know. I just have some evidence, from my dreams of like my teeth crushing against each other as I'm trying to dial the phone to get through to someone, someone I need, and the phone's falling apart, and then my teeth are falling apart. So why did I have that repetitive, horrible dream that woke me up every night right after I got married? Like, why did that happen? So I have a story about that now, because I had a good therapist who right away said, oh, that's oral rage, So why was I experiencing oral rage at the happiest moment of my adult life, because maybe the happiness of my adult life was making me feel the unhappiness of my early life, and maybe I was hoping for some kind of cure from my adult happiness that would take away the ghost ancestor aspect of my pre-verbal, only remembered in my dreams, but obviously, in my psyche kind of life. So that, for me, that's what happened to me. So I'm, of course, just always looking in my patients for some version of what happened to me in them, and sometimes I find it.
Other questions?
Language being important.
Yeah.
I was wondering how you put together ego as thing
Yeah.
in Buddhism. And I'm reminded of Herb Fingeret's comments way back when about ego doesn't make meaning, the making meaning process is ego, and anxiety being the failure of that process. And there's something in there that I don't understand. I was wondering what your thoughts are.
What's the thing that you don't understand?
Ego.
Uh-huh.
And what is the experience? How do you conceptualize it?
Yeah.
As almost as a homunculus
Yeah.
that is experiencing all these things.
Yeah.
And it's that part versus the
Yeah, okay.
flowing process.
Yeah. Well, I've went through a whole thing about ego. One of the earliest papers that I wrote was, ego and egolessness in Buddhism and psychotherapy, or some title like that. Because I was, I was learning about Buddhism, and I was in Boulder with Chogyam Trungpa was teaching, and he had like ego is the whole problem, ego, no good. And then psychoanalysis was much more, generous towards the ego. Roy Schaefer and ego psychology, like you need an ego. You can't, if you have no ego, you're just psychotic, So I was trying to figure that out for a long time. And super conceptually, the way I understood it was taking apart the various ways that people have talked about ego and realizing that ego as process, ego as the mediator between inner reality and outer reality. Like there's ego is just a word that when Freud used it, he actually used the word just I, the I, capital I, and then it got, in English it became ego. So that was helpful. So ego not as a thing, because our minds like to make it into a thing, because our minds likes to make everything into a thing, because that's part of the thing about language. Even verbs we make into nouns, kind of. So we need an ego. So let's just let the ego alone. Let the ego be free to do its thing without super identifying with the the really real kind of thing. So in that paper, I tried to take it apart, and I ended up with the synthetic ego, which is like the title of what we're talking about. I think from an experiential point of view, I could talk about it a little bit differently now. See if this makes any sense. My father was a very respected professor, of medicine here. And he was, he had no interest in Buddhism or any of my more spiritual pursuits. And he was a scientist, researcher, scientific materialist, believed in academia, etc. And he worked until he was 84 at the Beth Israel, until he got a brain tumor that was on the non-dominant side of his brain. So he didn't know he had it. His cognitive functioning was all, super intact. He was still doing research and treating patients and everything, until he got lost driving home to Brookline from the BI, on the route that he normally took. Got lost, ended up in Newton someplace, It took him an hour and a half to find his way home, because the tumor just affected spatial relations, balance and spatial relations. So by the time he found that he had the tumor, it had already spread, and that, it's a different story than I want to tell. But anyway, they biopsied it anyway, even though they knew it had spread, and then it got infected, and then he died quickly, which might have been a blessing. But before he died, before the biopsy, there was a period where he was very cognizant of that he was going to die from this. There was nothing to do for it, but he was still totally there. So I had one conversation with him from my office in New York on the telephone, where it was sort of like the advice not given thing, where I realized, all these years I've never really tried to talk to my father about what the Buddhists say about dying, or about anything else, but maybe I should try before he goes, just in case he might be open. So I had one good conversation with him where I was like, do you know what, I just want to tell you, like, is it okay? Let me just, I said, that feeling that you've always had from the inside of who you are, like when you were 20 and when you were 40, when you're 60, when you're 80, it doesn't feel that different, from the inside, like you're you. And even though the body's changing and so on, subjectively, internally, that the sense of you being you is pretty continuous. It's pretty much the same. But if you try to find that feeling, if you try to put your finger on it, it's sort of transparent. It's kind of invisible. So you know it's there, but you can't isolate it. I said that what the Buddhists say is that you can rest your mind in that space, and that's the thing to kind of ride out through death. If you believe, if there's anything on the other side, that's how you get there. And he was like, yeah, he listened. He's like, okay, darling, I'll try. And so I think that what I was trying to communicate to him, like, we could call that ego, you know, or personal agency, or the primordial unconscious, you know. But you know, it's not metaphysical. It's right there. We all have it, you know. So that ego, the Buddhists are not saying that that doesn't exist. Okay, egolessness from a Buddhist point of view, emptiness from a Buddhist point of view, is not saying that's an illusion. You know, the Buddhists say that is not illusion, that everything else, it might be illusion, but that, you know, that's as close as you can get to real. You know, and because the Buddhists do historically believe in life after life and the continuity of consciousness and so on, that feeling, whatever it is intimately bound up with consciousness. Whether it's the same as consciousness or slightly different, you know, whether it's a rider on top of consciousness, the Buddhists, they had to come up with some kind of explanation for, you know, if there's no self, what is it that's reborn? You know, and that's about, you know, when you get into really the esoteric Buddhist thing, they have, you know, like there's a tiny little thread, there's a tiny little hair, there's a tiny little sliver of something that, you know, but I think that's what I was trying to put my dad in touch with. And I think you can, there's all kinds of ways that you can see the excessive clinging to ego that we all understand in addiction and in personality and identity, you know, that the Buddhists and even the good psychotherapists are trying to strip away. But that central thing, that, you know, that is in all of us, that we are uncovering or making space for in meditation. That's no Buddhist is going to challenge that.
Nice. Thank you.
If that wasn't too much of a downer of a story. Sorry.
So do you have a shorthand name for that thing? What do you call that thing?
Well, I'm almost ready to bring back the idea of soul. So with Thurman, Robert Thurman, who I sometimes teach with, he'll use the word soul for that. You know, in ancient India, Buddhism came in on the heels of a philosophy that was already there, that was like, you know, self with a big S, soul with a big S, Atman and Brahma, and they had a whole metaphysical thing of like, you know, a transcendent reality, and the inside each person is a little tiny reflection of this transcendent reality. And a lot of us are prone to think that way too. Buddha came in and it's like, that's too abstract, you're getting lost in this, let's pull all that away and just go deep into our actual experience now. And so he was like, you know, no soul, no self, that's what he was getting at. But what he was uncovering in himself, I think, was close to what I'm trying to describe. He called, you know, that got called Buddha nature, and you know, because it was his true nature. So that's just like your true nature. You know, I would call that your true nature. You could call it whatever you want. You know.
And the Winnicott would say it's a true self?
Winnicott, yes, that's very good. Winnicott, you know, talked about false self. You know, not that, sort of like a Buddhist, not this, not that. You know, when it came to true self, he was very reluctant to define it. He was like, who is it that's listening to a symphony? You know, who is it that's playing a game? Who is it that's enjoying a sports event? Who is it that's dancing? You know, and that's as close as he would get to the true self. So I think that applies. You know, who is it that dies, or doesn't die?
Or is the focus on the knowing rather than on who knows?
Well, there's a big Buddha, when you get deep into the meditation, one of the classic questions that is being asked of you and that you're asking yourself is, who knows? Like you're, the gong goes off and you hear the sound. Who's knowing the sound? So by looking for who knows, you can't find it. They talk about it as like you become like a dog chasing its own tail, searching for who it is that's knowing, and that makes you a little bit dizzy. But no, this is a classic thing. But that dizziness is good. That dizziness is because you're really looking at who it is that knows, and you can't find it. Like I was telling my dad, it's sort of invisible. You can't find it, and at a certain point of the not finding, something relaxes inside of you, and you're like, okay, I'm just knowing. So maybe there's still that sense of, I'm still knowing, but sometimes the whole thing just pops. And there really is just knowing, but even though you know that you're you knowing, somewhere in there, there's some relief.
Remind me that something that Robbie Bosnack used to say all the time, which is that the best therapeutic sessions are the ones where your patient leaves more confused than when they came in.
Well, I find that a lot. Though, like, I was trying to remember what happened. It was so meaningful, but I couldn't remember it at all. So I can't remember it either.
So I guess we should wrap up now, and I want to say it's been a really incredible night, and I really appreciate Mark coming up here, and perhaps we can do it again sometime. And thank you all for coming out and supporting this lecture series. So, thank you.
I just want to say how, I didn't get to say it, I forgot, how supportive I feel of programs like this that are still encouraging like real psychotherapy. Like I've talked a lot about Buddhism, but really like psychotherapy is a miracle that it exists in our culture and it's so useful, and I really believe in it. So I really encourage you, those of you who are drawn to it, to pursue it.
Great. Thank you all.